My name is Allison Madison with Wisconsin Saltwise, and I am here today to present Road Salt 101 for Wisconsin towns and villages. Our presentation today was inspired by John Crump from the community of Lake Mills, Wisconsin, and he will be a co-organizer on our event today. But we welcome you whether you're from the Lake Mills community or any part of Wisconsin or elsewhere. So starting out, I have a slide with a map of Wisconsin and Wisconsin surface water.
I do want to talk about it. Yeah.
And you might think that this is an interesting choice for a presentation on road salt. But there's a reason for that. I'm going to stop sharing for a moment so you can see me again. So I grew up in Bloomer, Wisconsin, the town of Bloomer in Chippewa County. And I grew up spending a lot of time on freshwater lakes and streams, exploring, paddling, swimming, catching fish. And I love all those activities. And I love the state of Wisconsin. It's actually named after a river. And I've paddled that river up near Eagle River, Wisconsin, where it's little more than a meandering stream. And I've paddled it around in the lower Wisconsin, where people love to raft and hang out all summer. And my feeling going into this is probably many, maybe even the majority of you have a lot of memories on Wisconsin lakes and streams, exploring through wetlands, etc. And so I'm starting with that slide with the map of Wisconsin to help us remember, or at least me remember, my why for why I'm here today. And that why is to protect Wisconsin fresh water, both surface water and our drinking water, from the threat of salt pollution. And that love of water doesn't have to be the only reason why. There are actually billions of other reasons why to care about this issue. But for me, that is my why. So I'll go back to my slides here. So here I am, I don't know, maybe age 8 or so, up in northern Chippewa County with my brother and a fishing pole. Pretty iconic photo of Wisconsin, probably one that many of you have as well, with different people in it, of course. And here I am just a couple years ago on a lake in Rusk County where my family has a little cabin on the lake. So I love being out on the water, and our water right now is under threat from salt. Not just the salt we've been putting in the water this last winter, putting on our roads this winter. It's the salt that we've been putting down for the last 50, 60 years. It's the salt that we put down in scoopfuls, that we put down behind trucks, that we put into our water softeners. This mountain of salt, this photo is from the Port of Milwaukee. All of that salt goes into our fresh water.
And
nationally, we put down 24 million tons of salt a year. And like I said, it all goes into our water. So just a little, I said this was Road Salt 101, so I'm going to do just a little bit of water chemistry. I am a former high school chemistry teacher, so I couldn't resist. But we have here, as many of you are familiar with, H2O, water, right? And we know those water molecules really like one another. They like one another so much that water in its liquid form is more dense than its solid form. The only material on Earth for which that's true. Those water molecules, though, form crystal structures, ice, and it's, fairly tough to break them unless we warm them up. We get them to move around and move apart from one another. But another way to do that, another way to break that ice crystal and to turn it into the liquid water or move around is to add salt. And we do that, right, on our roads and sidewalks and driveways. And when we add that salt, the water molecules move around the sodium and the chloride ions, as you can see in these two diagrams, with the water molecules, the triatomic molecule around the chloride here and the sodium there. And so the water dissolves that salt and it holds it forever. It is really, really hard to get water to let go of that salt. Pretty much impossible unless we use the process of reverse osmosis, which requires a lot of energy and is thus very, very expensive and not really practical for us to do in our fresh water, even our wastewater. So when you see salt out on sidewalks and roads, maybe in salt sheds, I want you to begin to see all of that salt and where it's headed and where it's going to stay once it gets there. As I mentioned, the love of fresh water is why I'm driven to do this work, but it's not the only reason. Salt is a really powerful tool, and it can do a lot of damage on our roads and on the vegetation near them. Damages to vegetation are estimated by a University of Washington professor to be around $2 billion a year. This is nationally. Nationally, also, salt does about 5 billion of damage to our infrastructure. So it accelerates premature aging of our bridges and our roads. We don't necessarily spend $5 billion a year, but we're doing that much damage, right? I think we all know that we're not keeping up with the infrastructure damage. It also can create a lot of problems on our vehicles. AAA estimates damage to personal vehicles being around $3 billion a year from salt. And here we see a picture of someone's driveway that's been in better shape before a lot of salt application. So all in all, for every dollar that we spend on salt, it's estimated that around $10 of damage are done. In other words, every time that you spend $1 as a municipality on salt, you really should be putting $10 in the bank to pay for the damage that you're going to have to deal with down the road. Salt begins to look a lot less cheap when we start to really take into effect all of the externalities, all the damage that it causes. But while I said salt is cheap, it's becoming a bit less so. This data from the DNR shows the cost of salt per ton for the state. So this is the cost per ton that counties and municipalities pay if they get their salt through the state bid. So this last winter, salt was averaging around $80 a ton. I think the bid maybe came in just a little under that, high 70s, but that is doubled, almost tripled from just 20 years ago. And estimations are that next year, the salt price is going to go up quite a bit more. And then again, I would ask you to think about the cost to our fresh water. And just to give a little bit more perspective on that, in Wisconsin, we really don't naturally have chloride or salt in our water. But the DNR and others who monitor our streams and lakes, people like Sewer PC, which is the Southeastern Wisconsin Regional Planning Commission, the USGS, who have been monitoring our surface waters, are seeing concentrations sometimes as high as 3,000, even 7,000 milligrams per liter. Both of these figures did come from Southeastern Wisconsin rivers and streams. So for perspective again on that, those numbers are well over the 757 milligrams per liter that the DNR has set as a limit for acute exposure. So acute exposure means that organisms exposed to these concentrations for even a short period of time are going to experience negative impacts. The DNR has set a second limit of 395 for chronic exposure. So chronic exposure means organisms can deal with this, but if they continue to be in these conditions for long, then they're going to be experiencing negative impacts. It is, I think, worth noting that the DNR limit of 395 is significantly above the EPA limit, that same value of chronic exposure. And some people are kind of looking down the road and seeing that the DNR likely will be reducing our limit to 230 milligrams per liter. So milligrams per liter, if you're not a former chemistry teacher, to put that in perspective again, This 395 milligrams per liter, this chronic exposure, is equivalent to putting 1 teaspoon of salt in 5 gallons of water. So every time that we see a teaspoon of salt down, you need to think to yourself, that's polluting 5 gallons of water. Every time that you can go out and you can sweep up a teaspoon of salt, you've protected 5 gallons of water. So gallons of water, teaspoons of salt, milligrams per liter, what does that really mean? So here are some organisms that live in that fresh water. And these photos were taken by Bill Hintz in the University of Toledo. If you want to learn more about Bill's research on the impacts of salt on freshwater ecosystems, I would encourage you to check out his archive talk from Wisconsin Salt Awareness Week. That's on our YouTube channel, our SaltWise YouTube channel. There he presented about the direct impacts of salt on fish growth and reproduction. So I think these photos of fish that have been living in a high road salt versus no road salt environment are going to speak for themselves. But it's not as simple as that. So beyond these direct impacts, when we increase salt concentrations, the first organisms that tend to be impacted are our zooplankton. And zooplankton eat algae. So as the zooplankton populations go down, that leads to a positive impact on the algae, their food. Those concentrations go up and we have greener, murkier water. I don't think that's anyone's favorite type of water to go swimming or kayaking in. Also, as the zooplankton concentrations go down, there's less food available for that next level, trophic level up the ecosystem. For the food chain, the planktivorous fish, their populations go down. And as their populations go down, the piscivorous fish that eat them are going to be negatively impacted as well. So here is a map showing fluoride concentrations in our lakes and rivers currently in Wisconsin. This data was taken from the waterqualitydata.us and put together by Linnea Rock, who's a graduate student at UW-Madison. So we do see a lot of purple dots, which is encouraging. Like I said, naturally in Wisconsin, there's pretty much no chloride naturally found in our water, except for a couple key parts of the state. And UW Stevens Point, an extension groundwater specialist, Kevin Masaryk, when he speaks, he tells people at least all of our water would be under 10 milligrams per liter of chloride. But every time that we see a red dot here, an orange dot, and unfortunately some yellow dots, we see that we have allowed chloride that we've put down on our roads, chlorides that we've put down in the form of potassium chloride fertilizers on our farm fields, chlorides that we've put into our water softeners, chlorides we've put down in dust suppressants. All of those chlorides, all of those salts have made their way into our water. So the numbers I showed you look pretty bad. Unfortunately or fortunately, it could be even worse. New York State has seen that some of their freshwater lakes in the Adirondacks have stopped natural mixing cycles due to the amount of chloride that has built up in them. So I was actually very lucky to be able to ride my bicycle in this area, biked right through there in Lake Placid a few years ago. And the lake looks beautiful. And I didn't really know that it had this problem. And that's kind of the pernicious part about salt. It dissolves in water and you don't see it. It doesn't change the color, doesn't really change the odor, but it definitely changes the ecosystem. And so when we're taking samples in our freshwater lakes, it's important to remember that if you just take a sample near the surface, you're not really getting the full story. Because saltwater is more dense than freshwater, that salty water sinks down and we end up with this cold, salty layer that inhibits lakes from doing their natural turnover or mixing cycles. So If this gets bad enough, we end up with cultural meromixis, and the lake just stops turning over. And this is disastrous to the lake ecosystem because lake turning enables cycling of nutrients throughout the water column, as well as cycling of oxygen. This is essential for freshwater organisms. In addition to its impact on our surface water, salt ends up in our groundwater. And it's coming in, like I said before, the same sources as we see for surface water: road salt, water softeners, fertilizers, dust suppressants. Because chloride is a negative ion, it can move down through the soil profile in the same way that nitrate and nitrate fertilizers does, leading to blue baby syndrome. Chloride makes its way down into our water, into our aquifers, where we just draw it right back up. And for most of Wisconsin, when we're drawing it back up, it's going into our taps and it's going into our water glasses right here. The majority of Wisconsinites do drink groundwater. So we are salting our groundwater, we're salting our drinking water. This data was taken from the UW Stevens Point Well Water Viewer. This is publicly accessible, and I would encourage you to go online and to search for chloride. You can also look at a number of other pollutants that have made their way into our groundwater. And all of this data has been aggregated from private well data. So this is not an urban problem. You're looking right here at the largely chloride that's made its way into our rural Wisconsin private wells. And when you zoom in, you sometimes see in these little orange boxes, these are scaled down to the township level. If you zoom into the section level, you can get finer grain data, and you see more of these little red and orange boxes, unfortunately. I did zoom in for Jefferson County since I know we have a Lake Mills audience here, but I was not able to get a lot of data. And you can see again, that's largely due to the fact that this is drawing from private well data that's been shared with UW Stevens Point. So the Wisconsin Saltwise Partnership that I represent, is a coalition of organizations that have come together to reduce salt pollution. The organizations that you see here were all concerned about this issue. They saw the data around the city of Madison of chloride concentrations increasing in our surface water lakes. They saw the increase of chloride in our fresh water, our drinking water in the Madison area, including one well that is approximately 10 years from tasting salty to the average person. Some people say they already taste the salt in it, but it hasn't technically crossed the EPA taste threshold yet. So Wisconsin Saltwise has been working in the Dane County area for the last several years, and other organizations throughout the state have also been working on the issue of salt pollution, salt reduction. And last year I was able to network with each of these organizations and also get a grant from the Fund for Lake Michigan to help to take the Saltwise work statewide, which is really exciting. And that's why I'm speaking with all of you today. So Wisconsin Saltwise wants to increase awareness around our addiction to salt and give people the tools to reduce our dependence on salt. We're not saying you can't use salt. We are just saying, let's be smart about it or be salt-wise. Recognize that there are huge implications to salt use. So we are very excited to increase awareness by celebrating a number of municipalities across Wisconsin that are already very salt-wise. So the Cudahy, just south of Milwaukee, in the last several years has reduced its salt use by 70%. As you saw before, 70% reductions in salt mean huge savings in the salt bill, right? And also huge savings down the line because they're not doing as much damage to their infrastructure. Also, they are able to save oftentimes on staff time as well in overtime. Out of this nearly 70% reduction, Cudahy attributes almost 50% of it to calibrating all of their equipment. And they do this every year. And for some machinery, they're doing it multiple times a year. And that has allowed them to reduce salt use by 55.0%. Now, this is not investing in new equipment. This is doing some training for staff and calibrating, working with the equipment that they had. And then their savings in salt from calibration, they were able to take those savings and put them back into their fleet and make equipment upgrades that help them get to that 70% reduction. They're not the only success story though. Middleton, which is actually where I live, has also sent everyone to the SaltWise training program, the 4.5-hour class that I'm able to offer for free right now through that grant from the Fund for Lake Michigan. And after attending the program, starting to think more about salt, they began to engage with a number of the recommended best management practices. Middleton was able to make some upgrades to their equipment. They have trucks now where you can adjust the amount of salt and the amount of brine that you put down. So you're actually putting salt and brine together as a pre-wet salt as it goes down on the road. And pre-wet salts reduce the amount of bounce that you have. So the DOT actually estimates when they're driving down the road, about 30% of salt is bouncing off the highway. Obviously, municipalities are not going to have as much bounce, but you probably do, have some salt moving into the gutter or up onto the curb where it's not really doing any good in terms of keeping the road safe. So using pre-wet salt helps the salt stick in place and melt where you want it to. And it also accelerates the rate of melting. So solid rock salt takes a while. It has to kind of start melting itself before it's going to melt the snow and ice. If you have pre-wet salt, it's activated and it can start melting sooner and get results sooner. And you can see Middleton has also been able to see those savings in their salt bill. SaltWise also works with private contractors like the Bruce Company here, who's seen 50% reductions in salt use. So we've seen calibration, we've seen the benefit of pre-wet salt. The Bruce Company is using brine or liquid salt as an anti-icing before the storm. So just to give you a photo of that, here's one of their anti-icing vehicles with a little boom here to put brine down before the storm. You've maybe noticed this on state highways. A number of counties are using brine before the storm. It's kind of like putting oil down on your skillet before you crack your egg into it. We've all, accidentally put some food in the skillet before putting any oil in, and then we're stuck there scraping and scraping and scraping. The same is true with brine or no brine. If snow comes down and it makes that bond with the pavement, and then we go out with our shovel or the snow plow, you've got a lot of compaction and it's really tough to get that snow up. And we end up using a lot more salt. But if brine can go down beforehand, the plow blade can come in and just lift that snow up much more easily. And sometimes ice doesn't even form. So we say, love the lines, love those lines of brine. One of our speakers today for the Q&A is from the village of DeForest. His name is Greg Hall. And the village of DeForest has been using both calibration and that pre-treatment with the liquid brine, and they've seen some huge savings. So Greg Hall will be able to answer some of your questions about that. Here's one of the vehicles from their fleet. We also have with us Matt Whittam from the town of Lynn. Again, in the town of Lynn, you see those best management practices. They're calibrating their equipment. They're incorporating liquid. I haven't mentioned yet, but applying according to the pavement temperatures is really, really important. We don't want to think about air temperature as much as pavement temperature is the key when working to reduce salt use. Matt also mentions one of his struggles he had to overcome was working with the "this is the way we've always done it" mentality. And I do see that people who go through the SaltWise trainings often come in and they say, I've been driving plow for 20 years. Like, what are you going to tell me? And then they walk away. And I've had some people go from that end of the spectrum to writing their evaluations. Oh my goodness, like everybody who does winter maintenance should be taking these classes, or this class. So you will ask questions of Matt as well in just a couple minutes. Before I do turn it over though, I want to acknowledge that the philosophy of Saltwise is one of promoting positive change. We want everyone out there to be a Saltwise champion. We want to be promoting these best practices that can lead to savings in your salt bill, savings to your infrastructure repair costs, and just the benefit of knowing that you are protecting our state's fresh water for yourself, your children, and your children's children. So we love celebrating communities like Wausau that have done a lot to reduce their salt use. You see here, we were able to get them some positive press during Salt Awareness Week this January. And I would be remiss to not point out that the Wisconsin DOT is a huge leader in salt reduction. I think I did mention earlier that Matt Whittam, one of the professors who spoke on Monday's Salt Awareness Week webinar, his video is archived on the YouTube. We also had a number of speakers throughout the week, and all of those videos are also archived on YouTube if you want to learn more about the impacts of salt to your pets, to your drinking water, on your home, business, and hear more about success stories, different communities that we've been able to work with this last year. I also threw in a couple memes here for those of you that are a little bit more into pop culture. I actually had to have a partner explain memes to me, so I cannot take credit for the meme. But it is a good reminder that we should stay focused on shoveling and not be distracted by salt. So I would invite each of you to work to become or support your community to be a Saltwise municipality. As I mentioned before, we have free trainings available this year. The next one is actually a week from Friday, March 12th. And we support the certification of anybody who's working on our state streets, working in parks, taking care of parking lots, any contractors. Anybody is welcome to our classes. We have a roads version as well as a parking lots and sidewalks version. And then there are also courses for property managers. Once you take the class, we hope that you would work to engage with those best management practices. Calibrating equipment, there are more resources on the website for that. I'm also going to be working to organize different calibration demos across the state this summer and fall. And please work to, if you're not yet, tracking your salt usage so we can see where you're at with baseline and help to work with you to reduce salt use. Another best management practice that I didn't really talk about is going in and thinking really deeply about every individual storm. I was just in the city of Wausau yesterday meeting with their streets department, and they were telling me about all the work that they do before the storm, taking in weather reports from multiple stations, thinking about they want to be using brine, getting their teams ready. And then after the storm, they go back and they debrief what worked, what didn't, how can we do better next time? Just kind of like a sports team would debrief after the game. And then I would encourage you also to remember that salt doesn't just get into our water from road salt use. Water softeners are another big source. And so if they are prevalent in your community, your municipality could be a leader by working to optimize any softeners that they have. And then finally, Saltwise has a lot of public outreach materials like the door hangers that you see on the slide. We also, as you saw before, work through social media and just regular media, where we'd be really happy to help you, quote unquote, spread the word, not the salt. So with that, this is a crew I visited yesterday in the village of Weston. Very excited to be chatting with me after they took the Saltwise class last week. So I'm ready to take any questions. And like I said, you can also share questions with or for Matt Whittam or Greg Hall, who are in on the call right now. So with that, I will stop share And maybe if you have a question, you can type it into the chat. So we do have a question that came in here from Jim Heslin. At what rate should brine be applied to the roads before a storm? Now I know that that's not necessarily a black and white, but Matt or Greg, would either of you guys like to kind of speak to the variables that you take into consideration when applying brine before the storm?
About 40 gallons a lane mile, as long as pavement temperatures are above usually 15 to 20 degrees. A spreadsheet flow chart that's basically a go, no go for any type of anti-icing. So if it's brine, you can eliminate some of the things because it talks about relative humidity, dew points, etc. If you have like a calcium chloride in your blend, but basically we follow that flow chart, and if you answer yes all the way down, then yes, it's time to go do your pre-storm or your anti-icing. If you hit a no in there, then the conditions aren't right to do it and you don't do it.
So I do see another question that came in here from Paul. Paul's asking, would like to know more about overcoming the quote unquote, we've always done it this way attitude. So I know, Matt, you talked about some success in that, if you wouldn't mind speaking to that right now.
Sure. Real quick too, if you want me to, this is our chart for anti-icing. I can scan it and email it to you. You can put it up for everybody, at some point on your website.
That would be great, Matt. Yeah, we love compiling resources and making them easy for people.
Right. So one of the examples I'll give of the way we've always done it kind of ties into budgets too, because at the end, money always comes into play with this. And in my former agency, we wanted to start anti-icing, but I couldn't get my board to commit to a liquid sprayer. They weren't very educated on the technology yet. To them, it was another expense. And, this is the way we've always done it mentality was dry salt. This is the way it's always going to be. So in order to break that barrier in that specific instance, I already had a liquid tank on my truck for pre-wetting. I built a spray bar out of PVC pipe that I just bought at the hardware store and calibrated it to make sure I was going to put down 30 to 40 gallons a mile of brine. And I went out with this little tank and I put some lines down on the road. And then when the event came, I made sure to take some pictures of what was going on. And then I followed up with my board that, this truly isn't the best way to do it, but this is the benefit of this type of maintenance activity for winter. And it kind of, a picture is worth 1,000 words. When they started to see what, the benefit was, what could happen after you scraped a road that had been given a liquid application before a snow versus a road that wasn't, that started to change the mentality a little bit. And we got away from, well, we've always just done it this way. My agency now and my former agency were also into pre-salting, and we would pre-salt before an event in certain areas. That was a big waste in a lot of different ways. But again, though, when we started with the anti-icing, that gave us the ability to show them we can still do this pre-event treatment. We can do it better, cheaper, and everything we want stays on the road right where we want it.
Thanks, Matt.
Yep.
I do see another question in here from Thomas asking about if we're aware of any grants or special funds accessible to towns to reduce the upfront costs. So I would say, Thomas, that, first, we do have options like what Matt just explained, kind of using the, backyard mechanic skills and getting something together that does the job, more the Toyota than, if we want to go out there and buy the Cadillac, version of the brine maker, the brine booms, you will be paying for that. And we have a lot of people who kind of made something to kind of ease into it. And then once those results, they have the results to show, then they're able to get more funds, convince people to get some more funds to cover those upfront costs. Now, that said, I am working with a couple different agencies that potentially have some money to support these changes. So if your community would like to take some steps to incorporate brine into your winter maintenance, and you know that the upfront costs would be prohibitive, I would ask you to, send an email to me through the wisconsinsaltwise@gmail.com, and we can kind of get a conversation going and see what your needs are and how we can maybe try to connect you with some funds. I don't know, Matt or Greg, if you have any other recommendations for people that see those capital costs as prohibitive.
The one thing I'll say is something I did currently with the town of Lynn is when I wanted to get into anti-icing and pre-event spraying, it wasn't going to sell for the sprayer that I wanted to buy. I actually found the sprayer on a surplus auction, and versus the cost of a brand new sprayer, I think I paid $300 or $400 for mine and put a few $100 more into it, and then I was able to do the spraying. So now again, I'm showing my board and then the general public this tool that I have, and I started out cheaply, and then once I can get buy-in from everybody to see this benefit, then it's a little bit easier to say, okay, I'd like to do more. I'd like to get more lane miles done before an event or whatever. In order to do that, I have to spend a little bit more. But that was an option that I was able to find and use, was just somebody who had a smaller unit and decided it was time for them to upgrade. So it was on an auction site.
Yeah, and Greg, did you want to jump in on that?
Well, I just wanted to say we took the class, winter maintenance class, like in 2016, and kind of going back on the last question about how do we get away from how we've always done it this way. Take the class. It's going to change your people. Their minds will be changed, and that's what happened with our crew. We all went, and they were totally surprised. We came back calibrated right away. Every year it's calibrated, and they're into it. We've always pre-salted too, and we're getting away from that as well. That's in the past. The salt, once we took the class, we learned of the salt reduction grants through Madison Met, and we actually were recipient of, I think it was 50% for our spray equipment and our tanks. So that's how we got into it, and we were able to do that, talk to the board and get the grant, and that's how we got into it.
Thank you, Greg. And just so everyone knows, I did not pay Greg actually anything to be here or to put in the plug for the Saltwise classes, but thank you, Greg. And he also brings up a good point that if your community is within the Madison Metropolitan Sewerage District, there already is a grant program in place. I know they're currently evaluating that road salt grant reduction program for this coming year, but I will put a link in the chat about that grant program, at least as it was last year. So again, that's if you're in the Madison Metropolitan Sewerage District service area. Now, we did have a question from John Crump. What is the role of using salt sand mixes? Matt or Greg, do you want to jump in?
Sure. When I started here, sand was the winner. We mixed, and that was one of the this is the way we've always done it mentalities and everything. And through the processes, we've eliminated it. This is actually our first winter with everybody using straight salt. So we're still evaluating usages and things, but the old adage with sand was always, it's there for traction. And some people liked it because you mixed it with white salt. So when you spread it, everybody could see the brown sand on the road, and they had that mental reassurance that the highway department had been out and they treated the road and everything. And with sand in general, I believe it was Denver. They banned the use of sand just because of airborne pollutants and the amount of sand that they were using. A lot of research is starting to show now with storm sewers getting clogged and curb and gutter systems, ditches getting sedimented in, sand particles washing into bodies of fresh water. There's been a lot of studies, and I was actually just reading one the other day. The traction mentality is a pretty much a false thing. I've seen a few different studies, and the one that has the most cars is, I think it's right out of Wisconsin DOT, but it said up to 30 cars will gain traction when you put it on hard pack. After that, the vehicles push it down into the hard pack and it's useless. So, and then they only advise it on, maybe hills, curves, very low volume roads, gravel roads. But even as a state, Wisconsin's sand use is starting to go down and down and down because although it doesn't have the impact of chloride, there's a lot of other impacts for really the lack of benefit you're really getting.
Yeah, and I would jump in there and say that there really is no environmentally friendly de-icer. So sand, creates sedimentation, has negative impacts to our freshwater. Chlorides do, whether it be, magnesium chloride, calcium chloride, sodium chloride. We even see, beet juice or any quote unquote organic material, if it's made of carbon, it's organic. When those sugars, those carbons make their way into our freshwater, they are food for microbes that live there. And as those microbes feast on that new food, they are breathing in, taking in oxygen, and dissolved oxygen concentrations go down. So no silver bullet here, unfortunately, no environmentally friendly de-icer. There's no truth in labeling though. So the bags that you buy at the hardware store may say they're pet friendly or environmentally friendly. Not true, unfortunately. So I would acknowledge Carl's comment here, a question about is there a change to plants and animals when changing to a brine salt treatment? So as Matt and Greg had explained, most salt brine is mostly still sodium chloride. There may be some little other additives in there, but we are still putting salt down on the roads. It's just that using brine allows us to really dramatically reduce the total amount of salt. So there are still impacts from chloride, but they are much less than when we're just hitting our roads, pounding them with dry rock salt.
And salt brine's 23% salt and 70 or 60, 78%, 77% water. So,
yeah. Thanks, Greg. 23.3% salt. So, yeah, mostly water and then salt. So Chris Barnes had asked practical ways to calibrate spinner type salt spreaders. I did, for Chris and anybody, put a link to our website where we have some video demonstrations of calibration for a lot of different equipment. And if there's any other calibration support that you would need, I would say, reach out. We can work on getting more videos together. And as I mentioned earlier, I do want to support some regional calibration demos across the state. I don't know, Matt, Greg, do either of you want to speak to calibration?
Basically what we do is we test each auger setting and we actually put it shovel it up into a pail and weigh it. That's how we do it. So and we've got a chart that we put it in an Excel spreadsheet and go that way.
Yeah, I know through the American Public Works Association, APWA, and even if you just Google salt spreader calibration, you'll find that chart. The instructions are very simple, and it's you know, it's a little bit of a learning process if you've never done it, but you do it to your fleet once, and then you'll have seasoned veterans who can do it in no time.
Thank you. We have a question from Mike Meyer. How long will it take before we notice better quality in our area lakes, etc., with these salt reductions? Meaning, does it take a while, years, decades before we will see great improvements? So Mike, I would say that when I showed you that graph of the Yahara lakes in the Madison area, we did see some, annual variability, and the greatest was in Lake Wingra, which is the smallest lake. So it did have the highest concentrations of salt, but also you saw the greatest amount of variability, or you saw that lake kind of respond to higher salt, lower salt years, which is, pretty hopeful. Lake Wingra has a residence time of just, I want to say it's a year or maybe a little less, meaning that any water that comes into the lake is flushing out of that lake within a year. Versus like Lake Mendota, I want to say the residence time there is like around 4 years. So it's a bigger lake, meaning more ability to dilute the salt that comes in, but once it gets in there, it stays in there longer. So in general, bigger lakes are going to hold the salt for longer. Obviously streams can, flush it out, but we do have the additional issue that as we continue to salt our groundwater, the groundwater recharges our lakes, and our streams in the drier season. And as our groundwater gets saltier, once the salt gets into our aquifer, that's not flushing out in a year or 4 years or even 10 years. That is more of a decades long process. And it's quite variable, in different parts of the state. But in areas where we have that salt in the groundwater, that salty water is going to be recharging lakes and streams. And so that's why we do see increased chloride concentrations, not just in the winter. We do see spikes in the winter with road salt, but we see increased chloride concentrations in our lakes and streams now throughout the year. And I know John would want me to add in there, and our wetlands. All right, so we have a question from Maggie Dar. In addition to overcoming internal, Matt, this is you, I guess, we've always done it this way. How do you get past public perception when they're used to high salt usage and love/demand bare pavement after every storm? So Matt, Greg, would you want to speak to that?
Well, the first thing that's going to drive anything is for municipalities, hopefully you have a snow and ice policy. And in your policy should be in there somewhere, the level of service that you're going to provide. And that's a great tool and a segue for everybody, because that is your elected officials' approval of what you're going to try and do. If you're going to try to make every road in your agency bare pavement and your elected officials support that, it's going to take a lot of salt. It's going to take a lot of things, especially on low volume roads, or as road temperatures go really low, it's going to be harder for salt to work. The public is definitely on demand. It's now. I want to leave my house. I want to do 55 miles an hour, and I don't care if it's snowed a foot overnight. It doesn't matter. I want. And at some point, the best thing to do is to take this information like is being presented today and put it in public outreaches to your communities, whether it's on, your municipal website, a mailer, an e-news blast, whatever you can do, to tell the public, hey, you know what, we're trying to give you this level of service, but in order to achieve this, there's a consequence. And is everybody ready for this consequence? And just like taking one of these classes that talk about calibration and using the right amount for the right situation and everything, the more the public gets educated, it may be more eye-opening to them to go, holy cow, that is wonderful that my street's bare pavement at 5 a.m. But if I turn on my sink to get a glass of water and can't drink it, is it worth it? So, the more education for everybody, the better.
We use Facebook a lot. Love the lines. We've kind of made it our own, taking pictures of our truck out in the street spraying. That's huge. We don't get as many complaints anymore from our residents. They're starting to see it. We also last year we sent letters to businesses for oversalting their parking lots. And just kind of show them, hey, here's salt wise. Have your contractors go to this class and they'll learn a lot. And I've noticed this year, not as much salt is being poured. There's some businesses where it's just salt. It's all you see is salt. And it's communication. That's what we need to do.
Thank you. We do have a question from Rick Eilertson. Can you talk about equipment you've evaluated for winter maintenance? Pros and cons, what you chose and why? So I don't know, Matt, Greg, if either of you maybe want to pick a piece of equipment or two.
Well, moving forward with my equipment, what I came into was basically the old manual control the application systems, and there was no calibration happening. So basically, we were taking a shot in the dark when we went out. This is where my salter was always set, and it seems to work good. Calibration tells you, what your system's putting out, no matter what kind it is. But then, little changes. Some people can afford to maybe change quicker than others. One of the first things I tell people, even if you have that manual system that has, you can't change its parameters for what it's going to put down on setting 1 for the auger. But one of the simple things you can do is know what setting 1 is, and if you have an ability to know what the pavement temperature is, you're going to know if what you're putting down is correct, if it's too much, if it's not enough. That's half of the battle right there. If you go out and you're not putting enough down, you're wasting that application. And same thing with the other way. If you're putting too much down, maybe that was at setting 2, maybe setting 1 works. But pavement temperature sensors are, you can get them pretty cheap. You can do even a handheld gun, which are unfortunately very popular now with COVID. So everybody has those, and those costs are going up. But I use a system in my trucks. It's called Precise. It's through Force America. The last one I bought, I believe, was about $700. It's wireless, so the sensor can be mounted anywhere outside the truck. It gives me air temperature, pavement temperature, relative humidity, and dew point. And I can watch, the dew points and the air temperatures. I can watch their trends, and that usually tells me what the pavement temperature is going to do, and then allows me to adjust accordingly on my application. So hopefully that 5 minutes answered that.
Matt, you answered 2 questions there, because Anita had asked about how pavement temperature is determined. So you're spot on. Greg, I don't know, did you want to talk at all about any equipment you guys have evaluated, pros or cons about specific pieces?
I think Matt hit it all on the head. I mean, we tested out the salt brine sprayer, and I'm looking at installing a pre-wetting system on a truck next year, hopefully. And that's about as far as I got so far with other equipment.
The other thing that, Allison, in your presentation, you actually had a picture of somebody's salt spreader controller, the Force America 5100. That's a very reasonably priced closed loop system. So when we say closed loop, there's a sensor on the transmission. And if I tell the truck it's going to do 300 pounds a mile, it will do it no matter what the speed of the truck is. If it's going 10 miles an hour, 20 miles an hour, whatever it is. If it's just a manual system or an open loop system, if you calibrate it and you say, my truck's doing 300 pounds a mile at 20 miles an hour, when you cut your speed down to 10 miles an hour and there's no control, you double your application rate. So you're all of a sudden at 600 pounds a mile, which would be over salting, but you know, that's the limitations we have to work with sometime with the equipment. So one of my equipment goals is any truck that we build and get brand new, I make sure that the three things are a closed loop system, a pavement temperature sensor, and the truck to have the ability to pre-wet the salt with some type of liquid. And I've made that basically like standard equipment on the trucks that I purchase.
Other thing that DeForest uses with their salt, we actually, once we get our salt in delivered, we actually put beet juice over the top of it, and it sits on that salt all, you know, as it sits in the salt shed, and just makes it heavier, so it actually helps keep that salt in the center of the road instead of, you know, bouncing off. And that actually helps at lower temperatures too. It's actually, I mean, it'll work down to 5 degrees.
I thought I saw a question a little earlier about, I think, calcium chloride in brine. I know that you can do that. I know people who do mixes with salt brine, calcium chloride, then they put an ag product in it and everything. With calcium chloride, I want to say you don't want to go any more than about 20%, if I remember right. Calcium has its own special ability to draw moisture and generate its own heat. It's a real powerful de-icer, but it's also a real powerful, I'm going to eat the heck out of anything that I touch, whether it be your vehicle or your bridge or whatever. Personally, I'm not a real huge fan of calcium chloride, but that's where that anti-ice flow chart that I had, that I'll share with you, Allison, comes in handy, because if dew points and everything and relative humidity start to get high and you go and put this on the road, it'll draw moisture out of the air if it's really very humid, for example. And I don't know the outcome, but I know of an agency that potentially over applied a liquid that had calcium, a mix that had calcium chloride in it before an event, and it actually drew enough moisture that it diluted the liquid product on the road, refroze, made ice, caused the accidents, and there were some lawsuits that happened. So with a product like calcium, you really have to be careful with dew points and relative humidity.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. We do use a little bit of calcium chloride when it gets really cold out. We don't go above 10%. So we got kind of a, we call it sweet hot loads, which is a brine, beet juice, and calcium chloride. It's 80%, 80, 10, 10. And if we're just using brine and calcium chloride, it's a 90, 10 mix. And you do have to be very careful, otherwise you will make the road ice. So,
yeah, I definitely say just brine in general, Matt and Greg, correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, there is a bit more of a learning curve, right? Than putting straight salt down. So you don't want to just kind of play around with this. Maybe you play around in a parking lot that no one needs, and get a sense of it. But otherwise, relying on resources like Matt and Greg, and we have a lot of municipalities, counties across the state that are successfully using brine. So, Saltwise is really happy to connect you with people in your community or region, at least, that, have been using this, and put together some more kind of brining open houses like we did last fall to connect you and help you get the resources you need. But yeah, we do not promote just going into this blind.
Yeah, brine is probably the most forgiving product. So if you're a little off with what you're doing, it's not a big deal. The product that I blend with my brine is called Beet Heat. Comes out of Indiana. It is 4 organics and 4 chlorides. The company touts that its corrosion value is close to drinking water. So I like the product, but with, you know, with the technology and liquids and stuff these days, everybody's making a product. Everybody can make you a blend of a product. The best thing to always do is to talk to the person who represents the company you're buying it from and ask them what, you know, what's your pre-wet application rate? What's your anti-ice application rate? Not only for a straight product, but for a blended product. They'll tell you what you should and shouldn't do. I had a vendor basically sell me or try and sell me an agricultural product. And I said, I'd like to put 30% of your product in with 70% salt brine, and this is what I want to do with it. And I totally appreciated his honesty. He flat out told me, I won't recommend you do that with my product, so please don't buy it from me. So, you know, it's really important to know what exactly you've got and how to use it correctly.
It looks like we have taken care of the questions in the chat, at least in the current version that I have. So with that, I thank you all again for tuning in today. Thanks again to Greg and Matt. Thank you, John, for inspiring this program, and reach out via email, and we're happy to connect you. And thanks again for participating today.
All right, have a good afternoon.
Thank you, Allison.